The first important lesson that I think we need to remember and think about is that accidents do happen. And my thinking evolved significantly after the accident and during the accident. And I thought it was very important that we begin to look at not just the likelihood of something happening, but to focus more extensively on what can happen and what goes wrong. And over the years, that risk analysis was largely developed to deal with nuclear power plant accidents, to try and give a perspective for accidents relative to other kinds of hazards. But I think over time, what has happened is that because those exercises were so theoretical in nature, it was very difficult for them to be applicable in practical decision making. So over the years, we began to rely more and more on the fact that things were not likely to happen, and as a result, we didn't need to spend money to address them. Clearly, the accident of Fukushima told us otherwise. And if there's nothing more significant to think about, it's the cost of the accident itself. A recent assessment that was done by the American Nuclear Society, which is a very credible organization made up of nuclear professionals, estimated in a report that they did following the accident that the overall cost, including economic costs, loss of activity, the loss of viable use of land, is approximately $500 billion. $500 billion is a tremendous sum, and that is only a minimum, and it depends largely on how long nuclear power stays offline in Japan. Likely that cost estimate would go up the longer they stay in the current configuration. So when we're dealing with nuclear power plants, what we're dealing with is a situation in which you have very unlikely events that can have very, very significant consequences. And what I've come to realize is that the usual ways of analyzing this with risk analysis is not very useful, because most of the time things don't happen and things don't go wrong. But when the one thing does that nobody can predict because it surprises everyone, the consequences are tremendous. We had to pay much, much greater attention to the consequences of an accident, to the economic impact, and to the personal hardship that can be placed on people. So as we think about nuclear power plants, what we need to think about is ways that we can prevent that situation from happening. And not prevent it in a probability way, but prevent it in an absolute way. Now, I will say that as we look at the current fleet of nuclear reactors in this country, I think it's very important that we appreciate in the United States that many of the plants that we have are aging, that these plants, many of them were designed over 60 years ago, 50 to 60 years ago. The technology is very old and it's very outdated. And I think it's time that we begin to reconsider prolonging the lifetime of many of these reactors. While I was chairman, I led the creation of a task force to examine lessons for nuclear power plants in the United States. There were 12 major lessons that were identified. Number one, or one of those, a very significant one, was that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission needed to stop using voluntary initiatives on the part of the industry as a replacement for regulations. And many of the things that failed in the plants in Japan were elements of reactor design that were voluntary requirements in the United States. And I was proud of the fact that during my time at the NRC, we changed a number of those and made some things binding requirements on nuclear power plants. But many of those 12 recommendations are still to be addressed and still to be fully implemented. And so I think as we go forward, it's vital that we continue to focus on implementing those 12 recommendations